The Intercollegiate
Psychedelics
Network.
Hey everyone, my name is Jeremy Scott, and I recently graduated from UNC Chapel Hill with a Bachelor of Arts, majoring in psychology. During my time in college, I was a research assistant in the Mine at Large lab at Duke University. I'm an active member of the Integrated Research Literacy Group, and next month I will be starting full-time work as a research program coordinator in the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research under Dr. Matt Johnson. My research interests broadly include psychedelics, consciousness, and mental disorders such as depression. I am passionate about optimizing psychedelic-assisted therapies to maximize positive patient outcomes and to minimize risks. My goal is to pursue a PhD in clinical psychology. Also, I'm currently traveling in Ecuador at the moment, so I apologize for any background noise that may arise. And my talk today will be on attitudes and perceptions of psilocybin psilocybin among clinical trial personnel across Europe and the UK. Okay, so to the introduction. Firstly, why should you care about this topic? Well, right now we're in a mental health crisis, and depression is a leading cause of disability-adjusted life years lost in adolescence. And the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated this trend. And as we're well aware, traditional pharmacological medications are often ineffective and can be, problematic over the long term. And so it's important that we develop alternatives, and the process for doing that is clinical trials, but we need to make sure that those results translate into treatment and kind of allow for like positive patient outcomes, and to be able to individualize the treatment as well, which is not necessarily as easy to do in the clinical trial process, but we want to get information on clinical trials in order to inform future treatment models. So in conducting a literature review of attitudes and perceptions of psilocybin, I found that clinical psychologists express some misinformation and lingering stigma around psychedelics. Healthcare providers were tentatively supportive of psychedelic-assisted therapy, but emphasize their responsibility for beneficence towards their patients and desire to mitigate risk. And similarly, social workers acknowledge that psychedelic-assisted therapy is ethically aligned with their profession, but they did still express some stigma and safety concerns. And ultimately, what I realize is there is a gap in the research on attitudes and perceptions, specifically of clinical trial personnel. And so with this study, I hope to fill in that gap to an extent. And my hypothesis was that investigating attitudes and perceptions among clinical trial personnel would lead to a more complete picture of the research and its unique barriers and facilitators. So jumping into the methods, for the design, I've used a cross-sectional mixed methods study, and by mixed methods, that essentially means both quantitative and qualitative data, with the quantitative data coming from a Qualtrics survey that I developed, and the qualitative data coming from interviews that I conducted. So the survey was designed to obtain descriptive data and to complement the interviews, and the survey data is what I'll be focusing on for this presentation. I submitted a retrospective IRB protocol, meaning that Duke University IRB approved the study after I collected the data, because initially I was kind of doing this project more as like an independent summer project without having like a formal research intent, and that was something that I developed later with mentorship from several people. For recruitment and participants, firstly, I identified them through clinicaltrials.gov, which is a registry and results database run by the National Institute of Health. And I was able to contact participants by email, invite them to participate in the interviews and take the survey and be part of the study. For sampling methods, it was a combination of purposive, convenience, and snowball sampling. So purposive meaning individuals were identified according to whether they're involved in psilocybin clinical trials, and then convenience sampling was used to recruit those individuals that were easily accessible for me to interview. So in other words, they were physically conducting trials in Europe and the UK. And snowball sampling meaning that after identifying initial participants, was then able to ask them to refer like other eligible individuals to participate in the study. That's how I was able to increase the sample size. For eligibility, it was essentially just personnel that were investigating psilocybin in healthy or clinical populations, and this included investigators and practitioners, nurses, pharmacists, and administrative staff. And the settings were academic institutions and hospitals across Europe, specifically in Denmark, England, Germany, Sweden, and Switzerland. For data collection, the interviews were individual semi-structured interviews with a sample size of 23, and all of those were conducted by myself in person. The survey was a Qualtrics survey with a sample size of 29, and the survey was also sent to people that were not available for interview, which explains the sample size discrepancy between the interviews and the survey. And the survey itself included closed-ended questions and Likert scales, demographic questions, questions around participants' role in clinical trials, their experience with psilocybin, their attitudes and perceptions, and their recommendations for future research. For completed and anticipated analysis, so first of all, we looked at descriptive statistics to examine categorical variables in the sample. So, for example, age, ethnicity, and education level. Then univariate distributions by trial personnel types were displayed using violin and bar plots to assess the strength of relationships between numeric variables. We calculated Pearson correlations, and in the future, once we plan to analyze the interview data as well. Haven't got around to that yet, but we're planning on using the systematic text condensation method for thematically analyzing the interviews, and then we'll see how that maps onto the data that we have already obtained from the survey. But the survey will be the focus of this presentation. Okay, to jump into the results. So first up here is our demographics tables. There's a few interesting things, but one thing that really jumps out is the lack of diversity in the ethnicity section. I think it's also important to note that we measured sex assigned at birth and not gender identities of trial personnel, being the sample population in this study. And we also, obviously, we also didn't measure like gender identities of participants or patients in clinical trials. And so I understand that that is a limitation. It's something that's not fully captured by the data. And also like underrepresentation of trans people is considered an issue in psychedelic research, but it's not something that I can dive into today given the limitations of the data, but that is definitely something alongside the lack of diversity in race and ethnicity that should be considered. Here's the data on investigative populations and outcomes. So as you can see on the left, there's a lot of trials on depression in terms of investigative populations. Also some on anxiety and um, other disorders, and also some on healthy individuals. And then the outcomes primarily where safety and efficacy are the two big ones that you see in a lot of papers, but also quite a few other outcomes that people like researchers were looking at that I found interesting. So for the key findings from the quantitative data from the survey, firstly, as evidenced by that demographics table, racial and ethnic minority groups are highly underrepresented, which is unfortunately pretty consistent with prior research. Secondly, female clinical trial personnel reported more positive experiences across all 5 treatment components that we measured. Those components being psychoeducation, preparation, administration, experience, and integration compared to their male counterparts. And I'll dive more into what that means in the discussion section. Some other important findings. So we found moderate to strong positive correlations between patient outcomes and treatment preparation and integration, really supporting the importance of the therapeutic container kind of being bookended by preparation and integration sessions. And in contrast to my initial hypothesis, COVID-19 did not considerably impact trial processes and experiences. Okay, onto the discussion section. So, kind of focusing in on racial and ethnic minority groups, we found that only 19.4% of racial and ethnic minorities were being recruited to psilocybin trials, which is problematic because clinical trials impact and inform future treatment models and outcomes. And the lack of kind of diversity could exacerbate existing inequalities if treatment is less effective. And what I mean by that is that if minorities are not deriving the same, well, it could be the case that minorities do not derive the same benefits from psychedelic assisted psychotherapy as white people because the model did not consider them when it was being developed in the clinical trial phase. So it is really important to increase diversity in these clinical trials. And then for female clinical trial personnel, again, they reported more positive experiences or evaluations across all 5 treatment components that we measured. And possible explanations of this may be linked to distributions in helping professions being predominantly female, leading females to evaluate treatment components more favorably, or alternatively, perhaps the processes themselves are better suited to females. I can't fully explain this result, but in any case, it is interesting, and I think future research would benefit from investigating this discrepancy to better understand and inform treatment components. And then, okay, so this is a lot to look at. Don't get scared, but it's a correlation matrix. And what I want to bring attention to is the top left corner, which shows moderate to strong positive correlations between patient outcomes and treatment preparation and integration. And so this really supports the importance of preparation and integration components in psilocybin assisted therapy, and has implications for how these treatments are implemented and delivered. For example, the recent TGA announcement from the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia that it states that authorized psychiatrists will be able to prescribe psilocybin, but makes no mention of preparation and integration frameworks that have been pretty imperative in clinical trials. And this result kind of shows the link between positive outcomes and preparation and integration, and is kind of like a caution suggesting that, to ignore those frameworks may not be what's best for patients in the future, as this is kind of rolled out as a treatment. For the COVID-19 impact, so in contrast to my hypothesis, COVID did not considerably impact trial processes and experiences, and only moderately affected patient education. One potential explanation of this is that privilege results in individuals being less impacted by COVID-19, aligning with the underrepresentation of minorities in psilocybin clinical trials. So essentially saying that the people in these trials were less affected by COVID because they kind of had some socioeconomic buffer that allowed them to be less impacted by COVID. And that again kind of underscores that these trials may not be fully reflective of the diversity of experience from different backgrounds. And it's obviously problematic if that's the case. In conclusion, for clinical implications and role of the study, so I think one of the most important things is the impact on minorities. It's evident that minorities are underrepresented, and some research does suggest that patients being of a similar culture or background or race as a provider plays an important role. And as it relates to this study, it's important to remember that the sample is from Europe and the UK. So some of those countries are likely less diverse compared to the US, but that doesn't really negate the reality that they're probably not representative to the extent that they should be. And this study does fill a crucial gap in the literature of being, as far as I know, the first one to really look at the attitudes and perceptions of clinical trial personnel specifically. However, more research is definitely necessary to better understand attitudes and perceptions and how those can inform treatment models and ultimately lead to better outcomes for patients. And it is important because patient outcomes will be negatively impacted unless we address these provider attitudes and perceptions. And access to psychedelics is expanding, but only for specific privileged groups. Here are my works cited. I can email these to people if they'd like, just let me know. And I'd like to also acknowledge some people. Firstly, Anya, helping me develop this project from the beginning. Dr. Harrison for helping me translate it into independent research coursework. And Kevin Garcia for coaching me in the development of this presentation specifically. So thank you all. And let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching.